virtually to this online seminar. Thank you for attending from wherever you are. Some of you in Nigeria, some of you from elsewhere. So let me introduce myself briefly. I'm Elodie Appart. I'm the director of IFRA, the French Institute for Research in Nigeria. This online session is about a collaborative project called TNOC, Transnational Organized Crime. And my colleague Gernot will talk to you about it. Dr. Philippe Fraud is also with us today. He's part of the research team of TNOC project. This online event is part of IFRA online seminar series, which started with the COVID-19 crisis and the impossibility for us to have any seminars as we used to do, like physical seminars that we usually organize at IFRA. So we changed our habits and we started an online seminar series. And for workshop, this one is a little bit different. This is mainly about sharing the research findings of the TNOC project, and also to discuss the policy paper that was produced. So it's also a new platform we are using this time. We used to have our webinars on IFRA's Facebook page, but since we are three or today to talk, we moved onto Zoom on Zoom platform. But I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Zoom, since everything is on Zoom these days. So I would like to thank everyone again for being here. I would like to also thank my colleagues, Dr. Gernot and Dr. Philippe Fraud for being also here today, for making time to be part of this discussion. I would like to thank Clémentine Chazal, my colleague, IFRA Research Associate, who is organizing all these events from the beginning of this crisis and who is handling all the technical aspects. I'm really grateful because I cannot do anything too technical. So, and she helped us a lot with throughout the TNOC project. So thank you to her. We would like also the fourth member of this project is Inidele Adedeji. Dr. Inidele Adedeji had a postdoc research position within this project and is the one who conducted most of the field work and is the one who collected most of the data we will be discussing today. Inidele is a doctor from SOAS, a university in London, but he's from Lagos, and he did a really impressive field work both in Nigeria and in Niger. And it's thanks to his great work that we're able to analyze so much data, and that's because of his work that we have all this material to feed our reflection and our discussion. So again, today we will be discussing and sharing the findings of this research, but we will be also discussing about a policy paper that was the main outcome of a policy workshop that we organized together with my colleagues in Ibadan in March. And actually, some of the participants who attended this workshop in March, that was like a physical workshop. It was just before we were unable to move around. So we had the chance to meet in person all together in Ibadan for 2 days. And we invited to this seminar a lot of practitioners and people involved in the issues we are going to discuss today. So we would like to thank all of them for participating in March, and for the ones who are also attending this webinar today. We would like to thank them for being here once again. So after the discussion, after the presentations that we will try to make quite short, not too long at least, we will have a Q&A session, and Clémentine Chazal will help us to moderate this Q&A. So you can actually send some questions through the chat box on the Zoom. So I thank you once again, and Gernot, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elodie. Just have to wait 1 second till I have managed to share my slides. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just enlarge it. You can still see me as well? Yeah. Thanks everyone, and for being here today, and thanks to IFRA obviously for organizing this follow-up meeting. It's actually very nice to know that many of the people that are here today we already met in March, at the time when it was, it seems like a different world at that point. And the policy paper actually also took a while, because there was all kinds of obvious interruptions going on over the last few months. I hope that one point in the future we'll see each other in person again, maybe sometime next year, when we can then discuss the final outcome of this project. What I want to do now is very briefly talk about the project. Some of you have already heard some parts of that, so feel free to take a nap, but the ones that haven't, well, maybe it's just a refresher basically. So I will talk about the project and a little bit about tramadol, specifically the tramadol aspect of the policy paper. And the project is actually called Hidden Narratives on Transnational Organized Crime in West Africa. I don't use that title here, partly because of the problems that we have had with transnational organized crime. I can talk about that a bit later. But the project looks at hidden narratives on drugs, specifically tramadol, and migration, specifically on the transport of migrants in West Africa. Why are we looking at this area? And I should say this is actually a project that started early in 2019 and will end by the end of this year, but would be extended into next year. So it's still a bit work in progress. But why we started looking at the hidden narratives of drugs and migration is because there was growing policy concern over the last 5 years, especially 10 years to some degree in the field of drugs, on those issues in West Africa. So West Africa was seen as a kind of new frontier, a new policy field that where drug trafficking or migration issues were not an issue before, and then over the last 5 to 10 years, this has become an issue. This is this is very problematic, obviously, how this was portrayed, because there's a long history of those activities, but it came to the policy attention over the last 5 to 10 years. Why we also looked at it, so we wanted to sort of look at this policy issue. Why did it become a policy issue to some degree? We were also interested in this field because there's very little research and data available on those processes in West Africa. They're often sort of considered under the heading of organized crime, sort of migration, smuggling of migrants, trafficking of migrants, and trafficking of drugs, sort of seen as these organized criminal activities. So we wanted to look at that because it was a new policy issue, but also because we felt that a lot of those concepts that we're discussing them, like organized crime, didn't really tell us much about what was happening, sort of why people were doing the things they were doing, essentially. So we wanted to challenge some of those often Western-derived concepts. We also felt that a lot of the data and the information or research available on those activities were very poor and very often based on state sources like seizures or arrests that don't actually tell you much about why these activities take place. So in response to that, we set up that project. The project is a bit different from other projects on those issues because it looks at two small places in particular. It looks at Lagos, major port town in Nigeria, and the trade in tramadol. And it looks at Agadez, a major trans-Saharan hub in Niger, and at the transport of migration. Both those activities are very important in those places, and based on our previous sort of research experience, we chose them as well to make it easier to get access to those relatively hidden activities. And what we do in our project is, so we want to find out how the tramadol trade and how the transport of migration works and how it affects people and how they talk about it. And how we want to do that, or how we have been doing that, and our researcher, Ini, has been doing that most of the time, is by doing in-depth interviews. So qualitative interviews that are about 1 hour or more long, and they are sort of interested in insider perspectives about those activities in the trade in tramadol and the transport of migrants. So we looked specifically, or we talked specifically at tramadol marketeers, transporters of migrants, as well as state officials who are trying to regulate those activities. And what we try to get at is their narratives, their ideas of what these activities mean to them, essentially. And it might also be worth mentioning why we chose those activities. In part, it's because Elodie, Philippe, and I, we have worked on related areas before on migration, human trafficking, drugs, and things like that. So we wanted to sort of bring those different fields together. But we have also chosen them because they are legally ambiguous activities. The trade in tramadol is not illegal. Tramadol is not a controlled drug. Migration is not illegal. But the boundaries are sometimes not clear, especially in policy discourse. And there's a tendency that they have been criminalized over the last 5 to 10 years. So we are interested in why those activities that were formerly legal, licit in many ways, how they became criminalized, what are the processes. And very important for us is not just hearing those policy narratives that we already knew from before the project started, but also these hidden narratives of the people actually involved in those activities. Are these activities acceptable, legitimate, and what's the illicit or the non-acceptable element of those activities? And based on those kind of these research activities on hidden narratives on drugs and migration, we sort of held, or IFRA held, this policy workshop in March 2020, where we brought together policymakers that actually work in these fields on the control on tramadol and migration, and sort of try to see how our preliminary findings could influence their policies. And what I want to do now is talk about preliminary findings on tramadol and then a little bit about the recommendations based on those. In terms of tramadol, it's a synthetic opioid. I think it's a good idea, and I think most of you will have seen the policy paper already. If you haven't, then have a look at it. There's more detail about our research. There's also more details on our project website mentioned at the bottom of the slides. So tramadol is a synthetic opioid that is often conflated with other drug problems around the globe. One example is when the UNODC, for example, and similar international actors talks about the global opioid crisis, they like to sort of link things that are happening in North America, where drugs such as fentanyl are a problem. Two issues in other parts of the world, like West Africa or North Africa, where tramadol, for example, is a problem. And this is one of the preliminary findings of our work, that these sort of conflations of drug-specific problems often are very problematic, because fentanyl essentially is a very different type of drug compared to tramadol. Also, the opioid problem in North America, for example, is a problem that is about very different. It is a very different type of problem to tramadol, for example, whatever problem means. So in the North America, this is about the medical diversion of drugs being diverted from the medical sector into the non-medical sector. There's a lot of overdose deaths, for example, with fentanyl. Whereas in West Africa, tramadol use is much more widespread, arguably. In Nigeria, it's about 5% of the population that has been using tramadol over the last 12 months, according to the UNODC. In terms of deaths, there have been almost or very few deaths reported. It doesn't mean there's no problem with tramadol, of course, but the type of problem is very different. So there's often a conflation of things that are happening somewhere else with things in places like Nigeria or in West Africa, for example. Legal pain relief is one specific issue that I will touch on again. Tramadol providing those a cheap legal pain reliever, for example, in West Africa. What we also found, so aside from this problem conflation, is that the context of the problem is often ignored. Now, tramadol is seen as a kind of criminal activities run by criminal or organized criminals, but there's very little understand, and that's already by itself very problematic, because we didn't find much evidence for that, although there might be, obviously. But the ignored context in our case is often that the healthcare system in many West African states have been facing a long-term crisis, and there's a trend, and there has been a trend since the 1970s towards widespread self-medication, and the high usage of substances such as tramadol are part of this kind of healthcare crisis and increasing trend of self-medication. But this is completely ignored in narratives about tramadol being sort of a new organized criminal activity, for example. One other thing that's ignored in terms of the context, that a lot of the pharmaceutical market in countries like Nigeria is unregulated, which makes it different from, let's say, North American markets, for example, or European markets. And we found that also when we, so people, when they have to rely on medicines, there's no choice basically, especially in rural settings, but also in urban settings. You have to rely on your patent dealer. You have to rely on your informal marketeer, for example. So the tramadol traders that we found in our research, for example, they would refer to themselves, or people would refer to them as tramadol doctors. These are the people providing healthcare in a sense, even if sometimes problematic healthcare probably, but you need to understand that kind of context of unregulated pharma market, of the healthcare system in decline, to really understand why tramadol is so widespread probably and what it means to people. Another thing that's quite important, and that's often ignored in dominant narratives, is that tramadol is seen as a recreational drug, is sort of consumed by young people sort of to get high or to enjoy themselves or to not be productive, essentially. But in many cases, tramadol is actually used to be more productive, because it's used alongside hard labor. It's used in a way quite similar to cannabis, as a hunger suppressant, as a pain reliever in many of those contexts. So the actual use and the use that is sort of perceived as problematic is often quite different. And then the final thing, and I'm sure that Elodie and Philippe will talk about that as well, is about criminalization. So what we have found as the major response to our activities is criminalization. Criminalization narratives as well, being very dominant. So in the case of tramadol, there's a drive towards making tramadol illicit, to make it much harder to get access to it. either by promoting bans of tramadol above a certain dosage, for example, or by cracking down on, like you see on the picture here, this is from NAFDAC, cracking down on so-called illicit supplies of tramadol. The codeine crisis in Nigeria in 2018 is a bit similar, where the government implemented a ban as the sort of major response to that problem. So criminalization is the major response, but criminalization leads to a lot of harms, sometimes more harms than the actual, than the substance itself or the activity that the government or that policy actors try to address. It makes it much harder to get access to cheap pain relief, which is quite an important thing for medical institutions, but also outside medical institutions, because if a drug like tramadol is being criminalized, doctors are much more reluctant to use it, much harder to get access to it, and much harder to get reliable access to or to get access to reliable supplies of tramadol, essentially. So what we have instead, and what we have seen from our research, is that tramadol doesn't disappear. Tramadol is still there, but it's alternative informal suppliers that are now supplying it. The prices have gone up for tramadol over the last few years as well, partly because of those these kind of criminal justice approaches on it. And of course, criminalization also opens up the door towards police power abuses, which I think we'll talk about in the case of the transport of migration as well. So what I want to say now, finally, so sort of the recommendations of our work, which is still ongoing, our research, is that essentially what is needed, and that's not just based on our research, but based on these conversations we had at the workshop and on the many inputs we had from policymakers, is that there's much more research needed to understand tramadol, but also the transport of migrants. Much more in-depth research rather than some quick, short or rapid assessment exercises, as they are called. What also needs to be done is there needs to be a better understanding of the complexities of tramadol. Even the UNODC is very explicit about, that there's a lack of understanding why people use that drug. Why is it so widespread? Why did it suddenly appear in West Africa? And we are actually not ourselves yet there to have answers to all those questions. So we need to understand the different uses, how it's related to healthcare, and how it's linked to people's livelihoods. And the policy responses obviously need to be a balance between law enforcement approaches, which are now dominant, criminalization approaches, and approaches that stress the health and the rights of the people using and people selling those substances. And the final thing I wanted to say, and that was one quite big conclusion as well, that and I think that links quite well to the transport of migrants, that what we have at the moment is often very externally driven policy responses, very incoherent responses on tramadol in places like Nigeria, but also in other West African states. And there was an awareness that there's a need to be much more coherent with approaches, that government agencies are actually far too often in competition with each other over this problem, because this agency wants to own it or this agency wants to own it, and rather they should work together and come up with something more coherent and also more inclusive of the people that are affected by that problem. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'll try to unshare my screen and mute myself. So I'll hand back to Elodie, and I look forward to your questions at the end. I think you're still on mute, Elodie.
Is it okay now? Yeah, I think I'm unmuted my microphone now. Thanks a lot for this introduction and also for these elements on tramadol issues, tramadol trafficking, and and the response to the issue. Just as you said, most of the work done on transnational organized crime is based on state and official sources and discourses. And we can notice that there's a lack of grassroots data from the grassroots, and also a lack of African perspectives. So in this project, the fieldwork was targeting actors that are engaged in these activities that have been labeled illegal, but we wanted to get a feedback from a grassroots level. So this is what INI, but also with the help of the rest of the team, did both in Nigeria and in Niger. So Gano gave you an overview of what is the situation regarding tramadol. I will try to also give you a few elements of understanding of what is the situation concerning transportation of migrants and illegal migration in Niger. So just to summarize the context, Niger in general, but the city of Agadez in particular is a migration hub, a circulation hub, and people who are either going to North Africa or to Europe in some extent are most of the time crossing the Sahara in Niger, because also of the deterioration of the situation in Mali. Niger became the main route since the Libyan crisis, since the Libyan state collapsed. So, of course, there was many drama in the Sahara Desert that you might all be aware of. A lot of people who died in the Sahara, and there is a particular event that provoked the reaction of the Niger government. Is the death of many women, many Niger women, were found in the desert. And so because of this humanitarian human drama, human crisis, the Niger government decided to implement a law, which is called the 2015 law, in order to stop illegal migration toward the north of the continent. But of course, the main thing was to, stop people from trying to go to Europe. And by this law, the transportation of migrants became a crime, which is a little bit complicated both to understand and to explain, because Niger, as you know, is part of the ECOWAS area, and the freedom of movement is a right that all the citizens of the ECOWAS area share. So this law is actually trying to protect people from getting lost or getting killed in between Niger and Libya, Algeria, and in the Mediterranean Sea. But of course, as you know, the law did not end the movement of people. Basically, no law ever ended the movement of people, never ever. So this one, of course, did not change the fact that people were still moving through the Sahara. But the effect, the direct and immediate effect of this law was to make this journey through the Sahara more difficult, because illegal, and of course more dangerous for the migrants especially. So by willing to protect people, actually this law had a counter effect of increasing the risks, increasing the costs, and then increasing the number of critical situations, and in general increasing a crisis that can be considered as a humanitarian crisis. So the impact is at different level, and this is what the fieldwork and the interviews conducted on ground have confirmed or revealed, is that the first impact that we can talk about is the impact on the local situation, the local economy of Agadez, which was for years based on migration. And a lot of both formal and informal economy was relying on these people who were actually using Agadez as one step among others in their journey. So transporters, but not only transporters, hotels, restaurants, food sellers, item sellers, drivers, travel agencies, a huge part of the Agadez economy, and also Dirkou economy, another city further into the desert. The desert was living on these activities. So the 2015 law had a huge impact in terms of financial losses, which have been evaluated as much as billions of francs CFA by the local authorities, who of course were complaining about the implementation of the law. And then the second impact is, as I was saying, the fact that the road is now more dangerous, because of course Agadez has to be avoided now. So transporters are taking other routes into the desert, which are not going through the main cities, but which are going more further into the desert. So it did not stop people from moving, but it made the journey more difficult, and it also changed a lot the local economy, the political economy of migration in Niger, because more NGOs got involved in Niger. First, to provide some help to migrants who were in difficulties, and also international agencies like IOM were also mobilized to not only save people who were stuck in the desert, but also to have the people who were repatriated from Algeria and from Libya. So there's a whole reshaping of the political economy of migration in Niger, which has a lot of indirect negative impacts. One of them that was noticed while the fieldwork was conducted was the tension in between the population in Agadez and the migrants who were getting assistance from NGOs or from international institutions. Because on one side, people in Agadez were suffering from the collapse of the local economy, and on the other side, some migrants who got stranded and ended up in very difficult situations got assistance from IOM, from also medical NGOs. And it created a sentiment of a feeling of frustration among the local communities who thought it was not fair to, in one hand, prevent people from doing their normal activity linked to migration, and on the other side to provide help, including financial help for migrants. So this 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 information that we got from the grassroots level, from people who were before involved in regular transportation of migrants who then became illegal transporters, also showed us that another side aspect was the transformation of the professionals themselves, the jobs, the job landscape in Agadez, because before, when the transportation of migrants was not regulated by a specific law, it was a pretty well organized activity, where transporters were professional transporters, where drivers were professional drivers, and they were actually organized within a union, transportation union. And all of a sudden, with the 2015 law, they became their activities became illegal. So many people just stopped, but the people who decided to continue transporting people through the desert were people who were not afraid of the state, and were not afraid of getting arrested. So it gave a bigger leeway. It opened a door for more criminal organization, more criminal networks to get into the business and to develop also their own business within the pre-existent migration activities. So globally, the impact of this criminalization is, according to the people who have been interrogated, who have been interviewed, is really negative, and it also raised an interrogation about how something that was completely legal and all of a sudden became illegal can still be perceived as legal in some cases, because of course you cannot prevent anyone to leave Agadez, for example, on a truck, and the application, the implementation of the 2015 law is in many regards really problematic, because people are arrested or apprehended on the assumption that they will take other people out of Niger, but when they are apprehended, they are still in Niger. So they did not commit any crime when they are still on the Nigerian territory. So it's actually it was actually very interesting to discuss that issue with people in charge of the law implementation, including judges or lawyers, because there is a very, very blurry aspect of the law implementation. How can you arrest someone who did not do anything illegal, just on the assumption that he's about to do something illegal? So this law had a negative impact, but it also had some major problems to be properly implemented. I don't want to be too long and to develop too much on the details. So what we thought as some policy recommendation that could come out of this research was, first of all, the need for policymakers and for governments to take into consideration the negative aspects and the negative impacts of the legal response to trafficking. and also the need to acknowledge the harm that was caused by criminalization. Another aspect is the need to develop regular channels to move within Africa and outside Africa. But many of the governments involved in this colonization do not have a complete free way to change migration channels, at least in Europe, for the European part of the trade. But more balanced analyze, recognizing also the complexity of the situations, are also some recommendations that can be formulated toward the policymakers, because situations on the ground are very different and are way more complex than the general overview people have when we talk about migration through the desert. So I don't know if my colleagues would like to take over and complete, add something, or even correct me if I was not accurate enough. Feel free. Should we take questions then?
Philippe, do you still want to add something, or I think you need to unmute?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of little points, just kind of building on some of the work that we've done on kind of transport of migrants in Niger. I'll keep it relatively brief, yeah. So as Elodie said, we have this kind of context of how things have evolved since 2015 in terms of the implementation of the anti-smuggling law in Niger, and the kinds of impacts that that's having and not having in terms of the political economy, and in terms of smugglers' kinds of livelihoods and perceptions. And so again, we've used the term transport of migrants so far because it seems to have this relative neutrality to it, right? So we're studying this practice that is not necessarily easily definable as either migrant smuggling or as trafficking, right? And so part of the reason that this is a kind of more helpful framework is that we have a linguistic ambiguity as well, right? And so in French, you would tend to come across the term trafic in a country like Niger, whereas that does not translate very neatly as either smuggling or trafficking into English. And so because we're trying to sort of assess the degree of legality or illicitness of these activities, and trying to see how it plays out across those various realms, this kind of term of transport is what we've been operating with as we've been working through and interviewing actors in the migration economy in the north of Niger. So just a couple of points in terms of context, right? So Elodie gave us some very helpful context in terms of thinking about how what the kind of background is of smuggling and transport of migrants in northern Niger, and what types of impacts the 2015 law has had. What I'll just chip in addition to that is some of the outcomes that we've had from actually speaking to smugglers in the region, right? Smugglers or transporters, we could say. And so the general kind of trend is a reduction in business, right? And so if we see this as an economy of motion and as an economy of transport, the net impact has been a reduction of mobility and a reduction of the ease of doing business, let's say. And so many smugglers spoke about a reduction in the number of migrants that they were able to carry, and a reduction in the number of trips that they would take per week, right? So in some cases from roughly 150 down to 50. So just from one testimonial, you see a reduction of about 2/3. And that's pretty consistent in terms of when we look at the data of the number of people who are transiting through Niger towards North Africa and elsewhere. What we also see is a change in terms of how the authorities have perceived the relative legality or illegality of transport of migrants. And so, one smuggler mentioned in an interview that being caught with migrants now is like being caught with drugs, right? So there's this kind of sense that at least some interactions with the security forces are increasingly difficult in the context of the kind of period since 2015. That also tells us something about the relative perceived illegality and illicitness of drugs in the context in relation to migration, which was much more socially tolerated in the north of Niger. What we also see is that, again, the title of the project is about hidden narratives. And again, we've kind of gone back and forth on how much we want to emphasize this idea of the hidden narrative, but we have come across, and we're trying to emphasize throughout the project, this idea that that there are less accessed ways of thinking about some of these forms of transport and some of these forms of drug consumption in West Africa that go beyond the kind of control or security oriented ways of understanding them. And so when we go beyond those things, we begin to ask questions of people who are in these economies and see, well, what are their experiences and what are their self-perceptions? Some of the interesting things that came out in the interviews in northern Niger were about self-understandings on the part of people involved in transport of migrants. So Elodie very helpfully pointed us towards the kind of political economy perspective, right? Thinking through, what is this economy like? What is it doing? And one of the impacts of that has been on the perceptions that transporters have of their own kind of social position and their own class position, right? They understand themselves as being relatively socially and economically mobile as a result of their activities. And since 2015, what you have is a reduction in not just economic activity, which was kind of logical based on the declining number of migrants, but also a reduction in their social standing. And so you have some cases where smugglers' spouses have left them because they're not making as much money, right? So these little impacts at a very micro household level have the kind of economic impacts that would suggest that criminalization is a vector of personal instability, personal insecurity for certain actors in this economy, which then at some point potentially might be a driver of insecurity at a broader level. So I'll just try and wrap up really quickly. Some of the helpful ways of understanding this sort of in a more conceptual sense, we've been sort of playing around with these concepts of the licit versus the illicit and the legal versus the illegal, right? Just to make these kinds of distinctions between the social acceptability on one side of some of these flows of whether it's migration or whether it's pharmaceutical products like tramadol, right? That there is a social acceptability that may or may not be matched by some kind of legal acceptability or toleration of these things. So I'll wrap up just with a few kind of ideas about what's on the horizon in terms of thinking about Niger in particular. So one of the things that we see is military deployments in Niger are increasing, right? There are elections coming up as well. So there's a number of things coming on the horizon in Niger that add a certain degree of, let's say, unpredictability or difficulty of forecasting what happens in terms of the migration economy. Certainly the trajectory of international intervention is steepening, right? And that's not just in terms of technical or policing cooperation, but it's also in terms of military cooperation, given the various forms of insecurity that we see across the country. The second thing is in terms of analytically linking different security threats. What we see in terms of intervention in Niger at an international level is that migration and the migration economy are wielded as justifications for much broader interventions, including military deployments. So when we hear about Italian and German military deployments in Niger, migration is often, at least at a discourse level, added in as a kind of background threat to which these types of intervention respond, even though in practice, these are much more about stabilization, counterinsurgency, rather than fighting transnational flows of people and of goods. So I'll just wrap up with a final point about embeddedness, right? And I think this was one of the recommendations in the policy paper, which is about acknowledging the embeddedness of the various practices that we're looking at, whether it's transport of migrants or whether it's the use of products like tramadol. That the recommendation is that these are not things that are distinct from the society in which they operate, and they can't be fought as such, right? And so interventions in these various areas, and I'll use the example of migration in Niger, have social impacts that go as deep as the embeddedness of the flows, right? And so one quick example of that is, again, smugglers and transporters' livelihoods in northern Niger are deeply impacted by international interventions, even though precisely because they have a degree of embeddedness in existing practices and existing forms of livelihood. So a note of caution in terms of how policy should approach these types of questions in terms of criminalization and intervention. I'll stop there, but I look forward to some good Q&A.
Hey, Gernot, if you want to take the lead on some question, we had a few questions on tramadols.
Yes, there's a lot already. So I'll just try to deal with the ones that I've read up till now, and then I hand over to Elodie and Philippe and come back to the ones that have come in later. So thanks a lot for all the comments and questions that you have provided already. We are very grateful, and they help us very much to think about our research as well. So one question was about if we have considered the range of the grams of tramadol in our research, because tramadol, as I said, is still a legal drug. You know, it's not a controlled substance like cocaine, heroin, or morphine. But what the Nigerian government has done, it has made higher dosages, higher grammages of the drug more not legal, or has restricted those ones basically into the market. And what policymakers have told us in our interviews, at least, that this has been quite successful, sort of bit of distinguishing the tramadol that's of a lower lower grams, like 50 grams, for example, and the ones that are much higher, 200 grams, for example. And sort of, it's only, they say, this aspect of the market, the higher grammages, that are being criminalized. But I think, and that's is a link to the sort of the issue with migration as well, or with the transport of migration. It's very, very hard for governments or for the states to really criminalize something so specifically, or to pinpoint. You know, it might be possible in theory, but in practice it is not. So when you might say that only the high grammages of tramadol are now illegal, it also does have an impact on the whole market in general. So it's the same thing probably with migration. You cannot just make something specific illegal. You make a whole, there will be ramifications for the whole market basically. And that's what we found with tramadol as well, that tramadol in general has kind of got a bad reputation among certain dealers. So even though it's still legal, it's not illegal, but it sort of, this criminalization has a wider effect than what is intended essentially. So the grams, in theory, yes, it's a great idea, you know, to distinguish between this and that types of tramadol products, but in reality, it has the same impact basically. It has still pushed. When we talk to the established traders about selling tramadol, they will say, no, we don't do this kind of stuff. It's not acceptable. You know, it's a product that socially not, that we just don't do. They still do it probably behind at the back door, for example. And so what we now have, people that are open about selling tramadol, either in the smaller or the lower grammages, are the ones that are sort of smaller scale traders. They call them hawkers, for example, in the markets. So the grammage issue is raised by policymakers especially, but it's never as clear-cut in terms of the impact on the market as they wished it would have. The other question was about tramadol and cannabis. If tramadol is a substitute for cannabis, there's a very interesting question, partly because I'm writing a book about cannabis, and cannabis is all over is in my head all the time now anyway. I think there's some clear parallels between tramadol and cannabis. We haven't found any evidence that people are switching from cannabis to tramadol. I wonder why they would do that, because cannabis is still widely available. Some people are saying it's perceived more of a medical substance, so more socially acceptable maybe to use it rather than cannabis, which is considered non-medical, although cannabis has medical uses as well. But we don't have any clear evidence on that, unfortunately, yet. What I think we do have evidence, and that relates to my work on cannabis, is there's quite a similarity of the uses of cannabis and tramadol, often associated with hard labor. So cannabis is not just about people relaxing and getting stoned or whatever. It's about being able to work harder in many contexts in Nigeria, but also in other countries in Africa. So it's about improving your stamina. And it's very much associated to the working class or working classes in the Nigerian context. And that's the same thing with tramadol. I think tramadol, especially in part because of that criminalization as well, has lost its, or if it ever had any reputation, basically. It got a very bad reputation. So both of those substances essentially are associated with the lower classes or underclasses, you might say, with hard labor, sometimes as a symbol of resistance. I think Ini, our researcher, mentioned that as well, tramadol being mentioned in the context of Nigerian Afrobeats music, for example, as a kind of symbol of resisting against the state or state regulation. That's very similar to cannabis if you think about Fela Kuti and things like that. So there is parallels, but what we don't know is if there's a substitution from one drug to the other one. The last question that of the first ones I saw was whether we looked at the weak law enforcement measures on tramadol supply and how that impacts the market. And I think in this context, I would just want to say, and that reiterates a point I made earlier, that I think what our research and what the policy workshop showed is that just strengthening supply controls doesn't actually work very well. It creates a lot more harms than goods to the people directly using the drugs or affected by the drugs. Instead, it's much better to recognize the wider issues that are underlying the widespread use of tramadol, which is a healthcare system that's in crisis, a pharmaceutical market that's not, or that has been liberalized and is unregulated, and where not only tramadol, but antibiotics and other kinds of drugs are freely available without prescription, essentially. So I think that's much more important. I think we discussed, and our research has also shown than just supply control. I leave it at these three questions and hand back to Elodie and Philippe, and I'll read the other ones in the meantime.
Thank you, Gernot. Maybe before Philippe responds to some of the questions, I just saw something about any positive aspect of the criminalization, and since we talked a lot about the negative aspects, I would like to try to underline some positive things. In terms of international collaboration and international support, at least in the case of Niger, the implementation of the 2015 law was a very important symbol, and was also a very important sign sent to the European governments, especially, but to the international community in general, to show that Niger was concerned about what was going on its territory, was concerned about the risks taken by migrants who wanted to cross the Sahara, was concerned about the death in the desert. So there is definitely something also that needs to be acknowledged on the will of the Nigerian government to try to fix something that was wrong. And one of the effects of this law and of the general effort of the Niger government to try to fight against human trafficking or human smuggling is a reaffirmed, reinforced support from other governments and especially European governments. So Niger has also got in exchange, if I could say, or have received support, including financial support from the EU, especially. So there are some positive aspects, at least for the Nigerian government. There was a positive impact in terms of financial support and international agencies coming into Niger to either help the government to implement the law or help the migrants who were stranded. But it also had an indirect effect that is the very difficult, the difficulties for external actors and especially NGOs to remain neutral in such a context. And during the field work, when INI and us were interviewing people, we noticed this lack of neutrality. Now it's a bit complicated for external actors to intervene in Niger, especially to provide help for migrants, without being also side by side with the Nigerian government and the Nigerian law to make this new legal disposition respected. So international actors like IOM, for example, are pretty much involved in Niger to help migrants who are in difficulties, but they also have to work hand by hand with the Niger government, and they are definitely not neutral toward the question. The only ones who can remain a little bit in between two positions, either for, against, or in favor of the 2015 law, are the medical NGOs. But even them sometimes find it hard to keep this neutral position.
Philippe,
sorry.
If you want to answer some of the questions as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. There's a bunch of really good and really helpful questions. Some of which I have good answers to, and some of which I are a challenge to find out more. There was a question about the law criminalizing smuggling in Niger, specifically about why the law hasn't necessarily been a direct driver of instability and insecurity in the north of Niger. That's a very good question, especially in light of the context of the continuing association that migrant transporters and their associations make between the implementation of the law, their lower economic prospects, and the likelihood of a potential rebirth of Tuareg rebellion in northern Niger. I don't have a clear idea in terms of causality about why the crackdown on migrant smuggling has not produced greater effects of insecurity, but I suspect that one of the reasons is that there are alternatives in an economic sense, right? So I don't think that these are the alternatives that have been provided by international funders necessarily, which have had a lot of difficulty flowing down to the level of individual transporters. But what you do see is that people who were involved in the migration economy have been working elsewhere and making a living elsewhere, but obviously making much less money and deriving much less social position from it. So people have been involved, for example, in artisanal gold mining, and even working in kind of more commercial jobs like trading. So there are still economic opportunities that are much reduced, but they are still there. That may be one of the factors that has prevented the type of more violent instability that many say is kind of likely as a result of the implementation of the law. Another reason is that there is simply much better management of these issues in Niger compared to the types of ways that Mali, for example, has dealt with what we could call national minorities like the Tuareg. So there's a much more developed peace building and conflict monitoring and anticipation system in Niger that may be playing a role in terms of preventing the likelihood of armed instability in the north of Niger. But again, it's something to keep an eye on. There was another very good question about criminalization and criminalization having a potentially positive impact on the economy. I don't know the degree to which criminalization in Niger is having a broadly positive impact on the national economy, but there are certainly very specific and somewhat concentrated economic benefits to criminalization that may accrue, for example, at the higher echelons of the state, because criminalization is a strategy that aligns to some degree with international pressures towards constraining migrant mobility, right? So it does come along with capacity building and aid and training, and generally an influx of foreign resources into the security sector. So criminalization and adopting approaches towards criminalization in the area of migration has positive economic impacts for some actors in the state, but I would say not necessarily a positive economic impact more broadly. Okay, so I'll try and tackle one more question. In terms of the kind of rivalry between agencies, this is something that probably Gernot can speak to about the Nigerian context, but certainly in the case of Niger, you don't necessarily have out and out rivalry, but you do have the impacts of different institutional designs making themselves felt. So on one side, you have very sort of control-oriented implementation through security agencies, the police, the gendarmerie, and so on. But you also have at least at a discursive level, a kind of human rights focus and a much more judicial focus through agencies like the INLTP, which is the Agency Against Smuggling and Trafficking of People. So these approaches are slightly different, right? In the sense that you have on one side a more victim-centric approach, and on the other side a much more kind of security-focused. They do have considerable interactions, right? They do mutually sustain each other in some ways. They both rely on the judicial system, but they also draw on different ideas and different understandings of criminalization and so on. And so the extent to which there is some kind of institutional interplay, it is as a result of the different kind of backgrounds of the people who might be working in these institutions and the different types of funding that they're seeking and benefiting from. I'll leave it there, but thank you for very, very helpful and thought-provoking questions.
Gernot, there was a few more questions on tramadol, I think, if you have them.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for your questions. There's just so many, so I'll try to group them together if possible. But there was one about, I think there was two about the sort of trade routes for tramadol. One was about Benin. Why was it Benin Republic such a major point as a transshipment point for tramadol, for example? The other one was about the impact of this. A lot of the tramadol is produced in India or South Asia, and then shipped to West Africa. And there was recently, or in 2018, an agreement between the Indian government and some West African governments with the help of the UNODC to sort of stop or sort of control the exports of tramadol before they leave India, which is quite uncommon, but was done. So those two questions, I think in many ways, the interesting thing here is that tramadol follows, even though the illegal part of tramadol, so the high dosages of tramadol follow the legal trade. You know, there's a lot of trade. I mean, India is the major supplier of pharmaceuticals in Nigeria and for many other African and West African states. So I think these kind of trades follow, the illegal trades often follow the legal trades, I found. And so there's no surprise to me that also Benin plays quite an important role, because Benin Republic plays quite an important point as an entry point, aside from Lagos itself, into the southwestern Nigerian economic zone, so to speak. So that's as far as I can say. We are not totally clear how the sort of the closure of the borders along Benin and Nigeria has sort of impacted the tramadol trade, because our fieldwork was just happening at the time. But I will assume that that tramadol will get through and also the impact of this Nigerian-Indian agreement, which supposedly reduced the supply of tramadol to some degree. I think in the longer term, or in a few years, there will be other routes that will be chosen. That's usually how it works. So there's no way to stop those substances if there's demand in them. So that's the two questions about the trade. There was one about the interagency rivalry. That's quite interesting in Nigeria, because you have NAFTAC speaking a very different language about tramadol compared to the NDLEA. The NDLEA, of course, is a pure criminal justice agency. NAFTAC is made up of pharmacists, most of the people working there, but they're also trying to sort of adapt a more law enforcement approach. But the current leadership of NAFTAC doesn't do that. So it's very interesting to compare those two agencies and how they talk about tramadol and how they see the differences of the problem of tramadol. So NAFTAC looks at it much more as a health issue compared to the NDLEA's criminal justice approach. And they do compete, obviously, who can own that problem to some degree. And the NDLEA, I think, is much more in competition with some agencies at ports, at borders, like customs, the ports authorities. So there is quite a lot of rivalry, and the different narratives stem from those rivalries, because one agency is trying to push their narrative. Another question is, has criminalization been beneficial for the economy? Probably yes, for some of the traders we talk to, because the more you criminalize, the higher the prices are. So some of the traders that our researcher has talked to have actually benefited in a sense, because it's now more lucrative to sell tramadol, even the higher grammage ones. But of course, it means it's not just more money you get, but there's much higher risk that you would be apprehended by the police or by the NDLEA. So beneficial to some degree for some people. There was questions about ethnicity, kinship, and class. Sort of, I've already made a mention of the sort of this link between tramadol and the underclass of working classes in Nigeria. Based on our research, we have found a lot of perceptions about tramadol and certain parts of the country. There's this perception that tramadol use is very widespread in the north of Nigeria, for example, in the majority Muslim north of Nigeria, because it might be more socially acceptable there. But actually and I think there's another narrative that says it's very widespread among women in the north, for example. But if you look at the data that's available, like the UNODC household survey on drug use, it actually shows that the major consumers of tramadol in the southwest of Nigeria. And there's no indication that women would be sort of more widely using tramadol. So one needs to be very careful to not sort of feed into those perceptions about what's the problem with the North, what's the problem. I think there was one question about with Boko Haram as well, and it's a pity that Ini is not here today because he actually worked on Boko Haram. And as far as I know, when I talked to him, he found those kind of associations between Boko Haram and Tramadol do exist in the media, in public discourse, but real evidence for people using Tramadol more widely in sort of Boko Haram fighters rather than other people, there's very little of that. So, but I think maybe Elodie might know more about that as well. And then the last question was about informal economies. What should be done about them? I don't know if they are actually a problem, but what is often perceived as the problem is the sort of the unregulated market, pharmaceutical market in Nigeria. And the government has suggested all kinds of ways to re-regulate it, because it used to be regulated, was liberalized, and now it's being re-regulated, but there's very few alternatives provided. So what the government usually does, it shuts down pharmaceutical markets like Idomota, Onitsha and places like that, and provides very little alternatives. And that's, I think, the same thing with Tramadol. It's easy to ban, to eliminate something, but if you don't provide an alternative, you end up with the same problem again, either in the same guise or in a slightly different guise, basically. And the last point was that I look like the Nigerian football coach who shares my first name. So thank you very much for that compliment. I don't actually know how he looks like, but I hope he does look as handsome as me. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot to you, Gernot, and Philip, for this very insightful contribution to the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for staying, for being with us until the end of this webinar, for the stimulating questions as well. Thanks again to Clementine for helping us with the whole organization. We hope that it was interesting and useful. I just sent the link to the project website where you can download the policy paper and where you can also find other informations about the project. So feel free to visit the website, to also visit IFRA's website where you can find other information about the project and about other projects we are conducting. And we hope to see you soon in real life or on Zoom again. Please take care of yourself and of your loved ones. Stay safe and have a great week ahead. Bye, and thanks again to everyone.